So some of you know this about me and some of you don't. I really enjoy fixing things. If you are a person who likes fixing things, give me a shout out. I get so much satisfaction out of it. Last week, or actually the week before rather, at the park, we had this barbecue. And we actually bought it for a really inexpensive price. Einer got it, picked it up secondhand, and it wasn't working all the way. And me and a couple other people got to tear apart another barbecue and put it together with two old barbecues. We made one out of the two. Got to use a rivet gun, got to drill into that thing. It was fantastic. I loved it. So much satisfaction out of it. It's not easy to restore things, to fix things. It's not easy. It actually takes a lot of effort. It's tedious. There are all kinds of difficulties when you're restoring something rather than buying something new or building something new. But it is so worth it. I've been sort of a restoration fix-it guy, I think actually all my life in some ways. There's a picture of a house that we're going to put up here. And this house was my first job. Okay, so this house is the Jacob Smith House. It is in Lacey, Washington, which is right near Olympia, Washington. It's about a 4.5-hour drive south of here. And this house, it was built in 1859, and I don't have a picture of what it looked like when I first encountered this house. But I'm going to show you another picture, that this picture gives you a good representation of what it looked like. So next picture. This is pretty much what it looked like when I first encountered this house. This house was built in 1859. It was one of the original homesteads in that area. And it had, over the years, it had fallen into disuse. It had been a rental home. It had been repainted 47 times. But then eventually no one was in it. The roof had collapsed. Half the walls were about to fall. And it was in the middle of an area that a developer had purchased to turn into a new housing development. And after the developer purchased it, the bureaucrats in Olympia decided to put this house on the historical register, which meant that you could not touch it. You couldn't touch it. You couldn't even change anything about it. You couldn't take any of the walls down and replace them with another wall. And so someone had then purchased this house from the developer for super cheap, actually for free, just with the promise that they would restore it. And they were having to restore every detail of this house, and I was brought in. They brought in some other teenagers. I was 15 years old at the time. They brought in some other teenagers who just couldn't take it because it was so tedious, the work to restore this house. And I came in, and my first job was crawl underneath the house, which has been lifted up by jacks, and dig. You're in a space just barely big enough to fit, and you're going to dig it out with a little shovel. You're going to dig out 3 feet underneath the house. So I spent my first entire week just underneath this house digging out dirt and rocks. And that's pretty much what it went on like, not just the dirt and rocks, but other tedious tasks like that. For 2 years I spent working there. And for some reason, I just loved it. This is maybe one of my favorite jobs ever. I also like being a pastor. But there's something about... There's something about, and there are similarities to being a pastor, actually. There are. Because the work is restoration, and restoration is tedious, and it takes a lot of time. But, let's go back to that first picture of the house restored. The end product is not just like a new house. In fact, it's something more glorious than if you had torn down the original house and built something new. There's something about the fact that it has been ruined, but brought back to life. And in fact, in a totally new way. Now it's a wedding chapel. That's what's going on right there, is the beginning of a wedding. There's something more glorious than could ever have been created by just building something new and destroying what was old. And this is the business that God is about in the world. Because there's something more glorious about taking a person, a human soul. God's not about restoring old houses, although maybe he likes it. He's about taking people who have been ruined by their own choices, by the evil that's in the world, and bringing them back, not just to where they would have been before if they'd never been ruined, but actually to a place that's better and more glorious than they could have ever been if it had not been ruined to begin with. Our God is amazing. We're in a sermon series right now called Turning Point. And so each week this summer, we've been looking at a story where someone turned to God, maybe turned to God for the first time, or in some cases turned back to God after they had known him but turned away. And as we look at each of those stories, we're painting a picture, a vision of how people now can also turn to God in the same way. In each story, it's not just someone who's turning to God, but also someone who's helping that person turn toward God. And for many of us, that story, the story of the person who's helped the person who's turning to God, has been powerful each week as we've looked at this. And again, this week we'll see that here. Someone who's known God is going to help someone turn to God for the first time. And today, the story is going to have a lot to do with the pain in our lives. Today, the story is going to answer the question. We're going to watch two different people answer the question, why did this happen to me? In life, I don't know if you've noticed, I know you have, bad stuff happens. In fact, this is promised to us. So when bad stuff happens in your life, when something comes into your life that you think, why did this happen to me? This is worse than anything I would have imagined would come into my life. I never thought this would happen to me. Remember that the Bible actually predicted that this would come into your life. Jesus actually promised it. Oh, why would Jesus, who loves me, promise that bad things are going to come into my life? Well, that's the question, one of the questions we're going to answer today. Why did this happen to me? We're going to watch two different people answer that question. So right away, as we go into the message today, the main point that we want to get across from this, the main answer to this is this, that God is in control over everything, even when it doesn't seem like it. God is actually in control over everything, even when it doesn't seem like it. The title of the message today is Finding Out Who's in Control, and the story we're looking at is the story of Naaman the Syrian and a servant girl. Sometimes this story, we look at it as Naaman and Elisha, who is a prophet in the nation of Israel, who's part of this story. But the two people we're going to focus on today are Naaman the Syrian, the commander of the Syrian army. We'll talk about him a little bit more in a minute. And a servant girl who's only talked about in 2 verses of the Bible. But I think for many of us, this servant girl actually will be the powerful illustration of how we need to take a step in our walk of faith in our life. So that's the story we're going to look at today. God is in control. I want to start out reading the first verse of this story. And we're going to look at how the writer of this book, and so we're going to be in the book of the Bible called 2 Kings, or 2 Kings, and we're going to be in chapter 5. And so this is chapter 5, verse 1. And you'll see right off the bat, there is an astonishing thing that the writer is telling us that's happening here in the verse. Okay, so let me read just that first verse for you. And then after that, we'll look at the servant girl, we'll look at Naaman himself, and we'll draw some conclusions at the end. But listen to this first verse. Naaman was the commander of the Syrian army. The Lord had helped him and his troops defeat their enemies. Wait a minute. So the king of Syria respected Naaman very much. Naaman was a brave soldier, but he had leprosy. All right, so right off the bat, you can see that the scene that's being painted for us is one of God, the Lord, who we would now name as Jesus, the Lord Jesus Christ, being in control of everything. Naaman, let's paint a little bit of a background picture here. Naaman is the commander of the army of a nation called Aram, which is referred to in this translation just as Syria. It's a nation that is in what is modern-day Syria. It was in what is modern-day Syria. And Naaman was kind of a self-made man in some ways. We don't know if he was from a noble family or not, but he's not part of the king's family. But he had risen through the ranks of the army and become the commander of the army because he was so successful. Now, this country where he lived did not worship the true God. They worshiped this other god that is in this chapter called Rimmon, or in other parts of the Bible called Baal. Raise your hand if you've heard of Baal in the Bible before. Yeah, this is a kind of demon god of the local area who you had to do all kinds of bad stuff to worship. This is what his nation worshiped. They knew nothing about the true God, the Lord, who is God of the whole world. And they thought that the way that things worked, where there were these gods that reigned over particular areas, geographic areas. That's how they thought things worked. It's not how things work. And we'll see in this story, Naaman is going to come to the place where he realizes there's actually only one God who's real and who's alive. And that God reigns over the whole world. He's going to see that in the story. But we see right off the bat, the way that the writer sets this up, he tells us something very important. Naaman is the commander of the army of Syria. He's won tons of battles. He's the most successful commander maybe in the history of the Syrian army. And he thinks that he's done all this stuff on his own. He thinks that it's maybe because of his God or because of his own strength, his own power. He is a man of great ability. He thinks that he's won all these battles on his own, but the truth is that it's actually the Lord, who Naaman does not know, who has been working in his life this whole time. And so this connects with what we talked about last week, that God is actually at work in the lives of all the people around us. Every person that you encountered at the park when we were there, every neighbor that you have, every person that you see on the street or you drive by in Surrey and North Delta, God is at work in their life, even though most of them don't know it. This is the truth, and this is how the author sets it up for us. Now, this gets at our main point, which we just said was that God is in control, even when it doesn't seem like it. To Naaman, it did not seem like the Lord was in control. He knew nothing about the Lord. But even though he didn't know, the Lord was in control over his whole life. Now, we don't mean that the Lord was controlling Naaman in some way. People are not puppets. In fact, control is maybe not quite the right word. If you were to get a really exacting technical term to go at this, we would say that God is sovereign. Although most of us don't think of that word much, it means that God is at the top in control over everything, even though he allows people to make their own choices. That's what it means. God is so powerful, has so much knowledge and so much ability to control things, so much ability to arrange things, that he can allow human beings to make their own choices, and he can still direct all of history and your own life toward the place where he wants it to go. And the only person that can resist it, really, in your life is you, because he will allow that. God is in control over everything, even when it doesn't seem like it. Now we're going to take a look at the next couple of verses. And we're going to see this servant girl. And we're going to draw a few lessons from her first. And she is quite amazing. Let's read the next couple of verses, verse 2 and verse 3. Like I said, this servant girl, we don't even know her name. She's kind of a nobody in the Bible. And we're going to draw perhaps our greatest lesson from her this morning. One day, it says in verse 2, while the Syrian troops were raiding Israel, this land of Syria was kind of to the north of Israel, and they had not conquered the nation of Israel, but they were kind of in charge. They were running the show, and they would send these raiding parties down that the Israelites couldn't really stop all of them, and they would just raid and take stuff and steal and pillage and do whatever they would do. So the Syrian army sent troops that were raiding Israel, and they captured a girl. And she became a servant of Naaman's wife. Sometime later, the girl said, if your husband Naaman would go to the prophet in Samaria, he would be cured of his leprosy. Now, again, just a couple of verses here. But the Bible is so deep and so rich, we have to pay careful attention to what's being said. Imagine with me what's happening here. What would this be like? This young girl is in her village in Israel, and all of a sudden, let's just guess at her age. We don't know her age, but probably somewhere between the ages of 8 and maybe 12 or 13. So let's just say she's 10 years old. So imagine a 10-year-old girl. Many of you in the room have been 10-year-old girls before, so it's easy for you to imagine. Some of us haven't. Yes, it's true. So 10-year-old girl, she's, whatever, playing in her front yard, doing her thing, doing her chores at home, and all of a sudden, and this is a little bit hard for most of us to imagine, a raiding party enters her village. And there is nothing anyone can do, not her mom, not her dad, not anyone, to stop this raiding party. And they take her captive. That would be a seriously traumatic experience, don't you think? We don't know what happened to her in that, but it probably wasn't good things that happened to her in that moment. As soldiers from the Syrian army who are raiding and pillaging things take her to a foreign country. She's never going to see her parents again, and she knows it. This is a seriously bad thing that has happened in her life. Nod your head if you think, yeah, that's a seriously bad thing that's happened in her life. In fact, most of us, although many of us here have had major tragedies in our life, most of us have not had a tragedy quite on that scale or that visible. A tragedy that manifests, that powerfully visible in our lives as what's happened to this girl. Now, she was not the only one taken. There were probably many girls that were taken on this raiding party, and boys, lots of people taken into slavery to be servants in the nation of Syria. So she's taken back to Syria, and you can imagine this girl weeping over the fact that her life has now been destroyed. You can imagine this girl thinking, I'm just thinking about my son Nathan. He's 5 years old, and his mom right now is on the mission trip in Toronto, and every night he cries himself to sleep. Sad story, huh? I mean, it's not really that bad, is it? She's only gone for 10 days. But every night he cries himself to sleep. Last night he says, oh, it feels like she's dead. Oh, yeah, okay. Stop bellyaching, drama king here. But she's only gone for 10 days, and he knows that. Imagine this girl who had been taken into captivity, and she knows she will never see her parents again. Draw up in yourself the emotions. The best way to do it is to think of what's the most tragic thing that's ever happened in your life. That's the best way to get at what she felt like. Now, it would have been tempting in her situation, wouldn't it, to say something to yourself like, why has this happened to me? In fact, it would be impossible not to ask that question. Why has this happened to me? And there are a number of possible answers that the 10-year-old girl could give to why has this happened to me. You could think, well, God has abandoned me, or maybe there is no God. Or if there is, he hates me. Now, this girl has, as we've been talking about the analogy to us, she has grown up in church. Okay? It's not exactly the same. She was part of the nation of Israel. She was a Jewish person. Well, not Jewish, but of the nation of Israel. But the analogy to us, the way to think of it most easily, is that she's grown up in church. She's grown up knowing the stories. Jesus loves you. God loves you more than you can possibly imagine. He wants good for you. He's going to do good things in your life. If you pray to him, he's going to answer your prayers, and he's going to help you. You're never alone. God is always with you. And then she's taken captive as a slave to the nation of Syria. What could she think at this moment? Were all those stories that I learned as a little girl, were they all lies? Because it doesn't seem like there's any God here. Do you think this little girl was praying to be sent back home or to not be taken captive? What do you think? All right, come on, yes or no? Was she praying? Yeah, she must have prayed tons. She might have even seen her parents might have even been killed. We don't know. So she's prayed, and it looks like the things that she'd been taught as a little girl growing up in church, it looks like they're not true. And no doubt there were many others who were taken as servants, as slaves at that time in the same raids, who decided it's just not true. The God that we learned about, the Lord, he's not the real God. And they gave up their faith in God. And they decided then to serve the gods of whatever country they were in, or maybe to serve no God. But this little girl does not do that. Somehow, in the midst of all this trauma, she is able to say, I don't understand why this incredibly difficult thing has come into my life, but I'm still going to trust that the Lord is God, and that this, I don't know how much she thinks about this. No doubt it's not super deep in her mind, but she puts her trust in God that somehow this could work out okay. And even just in those 2 verses, we see that things begin to get a little bit better for her. She is sent not to a terrible place, not a place that she wants to go, but she's sent to become a servant of Naaman's wife. So she's sent to be a servant of the wife of actually one of the most important people in the nation of Syria. And I don't know if she liked that at first, but we can see from what happens next that over time, she actually grows to like and even to love her masters, the people who have purchased her and who she has to serve. She actually grows to love them. I don't know exactly how she was treated, but she probably wasn't treated terribly after a while. She loves them so much that as she sees something hard come into their life, she decides that she's going to try and help them in any way that she can. Do you see how remarkable this is? This is exactly the picture of faith that the whole Bible is trying to get across to us, and that we are called to follow as we follow Jesus. Bad things are going to come into your life. Jesus has promised that that will be the case. And when those bad things come into your life, you are not to despair. You are not to decide that God has hated you, God hates you. You are to put your trust in God, that He loves you and is doing good things for you, even though this terrible thing has happened. And then you're supposed to go and try to help other people instead of focusing on your own agony and grief. You're supposed to put your energy and strength into helping other people instead of focusing on your own stuff, even though it's really bad stuff. And you see that this 10-year-old girl does it. Instead of focusing on, oh, my life is so hard and so awful, she is able to turn and put her focus on someone else. She sees that her mistress or her master, the wife of Naaman, her master's husband has leprosy. And this is a terrible thing. He's this great man who's got everything going on. He's rich, he's powerful, he's respected by everyone in the nation, and he has come down with the worst disease of the ancient world. A disease that doesn't kill you instantly, but a disease that separates you from other people because it makes you contagious. A disease that everyone believed meant you were cursed by the gods. A disease that makes your body start falling apart until you look like literally a zombie. He had come down with the worst disease of the ancient world. And he was trying to figure out how to fix this. And all his power and all his wealth and all his ability couldn't fix it. And this little girl, she knows one thing that she's clung on to through all this. She knows that there is a God. There is a God. He is the Lord. He is the God of the whole world. And He can fix anything. Even though He didn't fix her problem when she prayed, she still trusts that He can fix anything and that He's good. And she turns to her mistress, her Naaman's wife, and she says this. She says, if your husband would go to Israel, there is a prophet there. A man who really, really knows the Lord, the God who is alive. And if he goes there, he can be helped. And so she steps out in faith and does this amazing thing, trusting God. Let's move on now and see what happens because of her trust, because of what she's done. She's actually answered the question. We talked about at the beginning, the question here is, why has this happened to me? This girl, the second point in your notes this morning, this girl has answered the question, why has this happened to me? And we'll see as we go on, it's happened to her. This terrible thing was allowed to come into her life so that she could know God, so she could really know Him better, and so that she could join Him in His mission, so that she could be part of what He's doing to restore people, to bring people back to Him. She's actually she's used by God here in a powerful way, in a way she never could have been used if this terrible thing had not happened in her life. Do you see it? It's a terrible thing. But it puts her in a position to be used by God, if she'll trust Him, that she would never have been in without it. Are you applying this to your life as we go on? We'll pull it together at the end. Let's look at what happens to Naaman here, because it's something very similar as Naaman finds out who's in control. And because of what this little girl has done, Naaman is a little bit surprised to hear that there's a God in Israel. Remember, he's the commander of this big bad army of Syria. They're way better than the Israelites. How do you think he views Israel? He thinks of it like the backwoods, the poor country that we're always beating up on, those idiots down there who don't know how to do anything. He thinks of them as bad people, poor people, dirty people. And all of a sudden he's told that that's the place he can go because there's a God there. Those people know a God that you don't know, and that God has the power to do this. And Naaman must have tried everything at this point because he's willing to try. And so what happens next is he goes to his king and he says, I know this is pretty weird, but this little girl, she told me that there's this guy down in Israel, believe it or not, who could heal me. Now, I don't know if that's true, but come on, we've tried everything else, and I'm going to die here. And the king's like, all right, let's try it out. So it sounds crazy to me too, but let's try it out. Look, I'll give you a letter, all right? So they send him, because, you're the commander of the army of Syria. You can't just, take a little weekend trip to Israel. That doesn't work. So he's got to contact the king of Israel, right? And the king of Israel right now is the son of Ahab, who, if you know your Bible, Ahab was a really bad king. His son was just a bad king, not a really, really bad king. Okay, but this guy knows a little bit of the Bible, but he doesn't really believe it. The king of Israel doesn't believe that God is real, that the Lord can really do things to help. He's not trusting in the Lord. That's part of the story that's going on here in the whole book of 2 Kings. So Naaman comes to the king of Israel with this letter from the king of Syria, and the letter says this: we heard that there's a God in Israel that can do powerful things, even heal people of leprosy. Could you please heal my commanding general of leprosy? And the king of Israel freaks out. He freaks out. I mean, imagine someone powerful and strong. Imagine, the prime minister comes to you and says, could you please heal my son of this disease? You don't believe you have the power to do it. The king of Israel freaks out. He says, are you kidding me? This guy must just be trying to start a fight with me. Because I'm not God. I can't heal this guy of leprosy. I can't even beat him in a battle, much less heal someone of leprosy. So the king turns him away. The king says, there's no way we can do this, go home. So Naaman's like, what is going on here? This little girl believes their God has power, but the king of the nation doesn't believe their God has any power. Now enter Elisha, who is the prophet in Israel. He shows up on the scene and he rebukes the king. He says, you idiot, just send that guy to me. I'll deal with it. Okay, so that's where we're going to start reading here. In 2 Kings chapter 5. Okay, starting at verse 8 now. As soon as Elisha the prophet heard what had happened, that the king had turned away the general of Syria, he sent the Israelite king this message: why are you so afraid, you big wimp? Send the man to me so that he will know that there's a prophet in Israel, and therefore that the God of Israel is real. So Naaman left with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. So Naaman goes to Elisha's house. Elisha sent someone outside to say to him, go and wash 7 times in the Jordan River, and then you'll be completely cured. I'll just read the whole thing here, and then we'll talk about a couple points, because this is remarkable what happens. But Naaman storms off, grumbling. Why couldn't he come out and talk to me? The prophet doesn't even come out and talk to him. I thought for sure he would stand in front of me and pray to the Lord his God and wave his hand over me, over my skin, and cure me. If I'm going to wash in a river, what about the Abana River or the Parfar River back in his country? They're way better. The rivers of Damascus are just as good as any river in Israel. I could have washed in them and been cured. But his servants went over to him, and they said, sir, if the prophet had told you to do something difficult, you would have done it. So why don't you do what he said? Go wash and be cured. So Naaman walks down to the Jordan River. He waded out into the water and stooped down in it 7 times, just as Elisha had told him. And right away, he was cured. And his skin became as smooth as a child's. Naaman and his officials went back to Elisha. And now here's a key verse for Naaman. Naaman stood in front of him and announced this: "Now I know that the God of Israel is the only God in the whole world." Now I know that the God of Israel is the only God in the whole world. Naaman was this self-made man. He was a man of power, a man of ability, a man of great wealth. And we can see in this story how God is at work to help him see that all that stuff he had done, he really hadn't done on his own. God had really been working in his life all along. And what he really needed was to see that he needed mercy. He needed grace from God. He needed God's pity on him. He needed someone else's help. He needed help from God. And so you can see in this story the great lengths that God goes to arranging things and through the prophet Elisha to make sure that Naaman doesn't think in any way that he's been healed because of his own strength or his own power. First, he's sent to this prophet in the backwoods that the king won't even send him to. Then the prophet won't even come out and talk to him. Basically, the prophet insults him to his face. Elisha is very bold in this moment to follow God, because this commanding general of Syria could have just killed him over this, right? The prophet won't even come out and see him. Next, he's told to go just, imagine this, he's tried everything, right? You think he hasn't tried taking a bath to get rid of his leprosy? This is kind of like us. Sometimes we've tried a lot of things, and someone will say to us, oh, maybe this has been said to you before, why don't you pray about it? You think I haven't prayed about this? Someone will give you a solution that seems really simple, and it's almost an insult because you've tried so many things to fix the problem, and it hasn't worked. But he's given this solution that's really, really simple. Just go and dip yourself in the river 7 times, and then you're going to be cured. Not because the river's so powerful, but because the word of the prophet is the word of the Lord. Because the Lord, who's over the whole world, is now saying you're going to be healed. So God is trying to direct Naaman to see that he needs to rely on God. He needs to put all of his trust in God. And for Naaman, what he has to do at this moment is take a very simple step. He has to humble himself. He gets all insulted that it's something so simple. And in fact, it's his servants who have to come to him and tell him, why don't you just try it? We've tried everything else, just try this. Just try this God of Israel, the Lord. And when he does, he's healed. When he does, he sees that the Lord has been in control the whole time. The whole time. He's able now to look back on his life and see that all these things that had happened to him are because God had been trying to get his attention. In fact, we see the third point for your bulletin today. What Naaman sees is that he's asked this same question. He got leprosy after he was right at the peak of his power, the greatest time in his life, and he gets the worst disease in the ancient world. Why has this happened to me? And the answer is this: it happened so that you could come to know God's mercy and you could live your life for him. That's why it's happened to Naaman. There's a number of places in the Bible where this is taught straight out and explicitly. One of those places is in Acts chapter 17. One of my favorite verses in one of Paul's sermons here, where Paul says this. He's talking to the people in Athens. And he describes the whole history of the world. Everything that's ever happened from the beginning. God created the world, and he created all the life in the world, and he created human beings, and then he allowed things to come into the world, and then he arranged situations, and he set up which nation would rule, and he allowed everything that's going to happen in your life. And then Paul explains why God did all of that. That is everything that's ever happened. God did everything that's ever happened so that some people might reach out to him and find him. So here we are. We're in this world where all this bad stuff happens. It's been promised to you. Whether you are a follower of Jesus already, you've given him your life, or you're just learning about him for the first time, you're not sure where you stand yet, bad stuff is going to happen to you. It's going to come into your life. It's been promised. And how you answer the question, why did this happen to me, will determine how those bad things are going to be used in the future. We have two visions here. One is of Naaman, this commanding officer who thought he had his whole life under control. He thought he was the man. He's the one running the show. He's going to be able to fix any problem that comes along. And guess what? God allowed a problem to come into his life that he could never fix. I've known so many people in my life who thought that they had it all under control, and then boom, something that they couldn't control. They couldn't fix it. And right at that moment, the question for you, if that's you, the question for you is, are you going to seek God in that moment? Are you going to seek help from the only one who can help you? You've been given a problem. God didn't create that problem. Let's be clear about that. God didn't curse Naaman with leprosy. There's bad things in the world because sin is in the world, because people have made wrong choices and evil has entered the world as a result. But God could stop any of those things at any time. So if there's some bad thing that's come into your life, God has allowed it to come, even though he didn't create it. And he's allowed it to come so that you might search for him and find him. And so if you're that person who's been thinking all your life you were the one under control, you were the one who had the power, you could handle any problem that came, and now you've been given a problem that you can't fix, that problem is God calling out to you. He wants you to enter a life that's better than the one you've been living, a life that is a life of mercy, a life of power, a life of joy, a life that is a life relying on God, not on yourself. And for some of us, we've been here for a long time. We've been following Jesus for a long time. We've trusted him. We've heard all his promises, maybe since we were little, like that little girl. And we know that God loves us, that he's going to answer our prayers, that he's going to do good in our lives. And then the big bad thing happens. Think about that deepest pain, that moment that something happened in your life that you cried out to God, why would this happen? I cannot possibly see how this could be good. And the Bible, Jesus, God today is calling to you again and saying, even that I allowed into your life for a good reason, for a good purpose. I allowed that awful thing to come into your life so that you could be in a position where you would know me more and where you would be used by me to bring other people to me. But you've got to be like that servant girl. Even when everything looks like darkness and death around you, you've got to say, you know what? I know that that's a lie. I can't see clearly right now, but I know that even in this awful thing, somehow God is working for my good and for the good of the world, and I will trust it. And I will not focus all my energy on that evil thing that's in my life. I will focus my energy on helping other people, because that is what God has called me to do. We're about to sing a song. I'm about to pray for us, and then we're going to sing a song. And in this song, it talks about how God pursues us, how he comes after us, how he will never give up, never relent, never slow down in trying to bring us back to him. The truth is that it's not just in good, fun things that God is pursuing us. It's often in the most difficult things that happen in life that God is calling out to us and drawing us back to him. So as we sing this song and we cry out to him, he's coming after me. He's breaking down every wall. He's going into every darkest shadow to bring me out. Remember that it's in your pain, often in your trauma, that he's doing those things. Let's pray.